to the History Slam podcast from ActiveHistory.ca. Here's your host, Sean Graham.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome to the History Slam, everybody. I am Sean Graham. We're coming at you today nearly live from St. Catharines, Ontario. It's the final day of the CHA annual meeting as part of Congress 2014. And one of the cool things that I like about Congress is coming here and seeing people who you really only get to see, or very infrequently do you get to see, including people who used to teach me at one point. And one of my favorites is here with us today, Greg Stott from the University College of the North in the PA, Manitoba.
And Thompson. I'm actually based in Thompson.
You're in Thompson, okay.
Yeah, sorry, but I do video link to the PA. Yes.
Okay, and so you're here on the podcast. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I'm very excited that you're here. You were at Nipissing University when I was in fourth year.
Yes.
I took the Canadian History Seminar with you.
Okay, yes, I remember that well.
Yeah. And you're one of the reasons I'm in grad school, because you wrote letters for me. So for those of you who like what I do, you can thank Professor Stott for that. For those of you who don't like what I do, you can blame Professor Stott for that. But it was a course that I really enjoyed, and the fellow students in the class, we all really enjoyed it, and it was a fun one. And when we learned that you were leaving, we were very disappointed.
Well, thank you. I do remember that seminar very fondly. I remember great discussions and perhaps an inordinate amount of laughter at various times.
Yeah.
But it was a great time. Yes.
Well, I remember I had the idea for my presentation to recreate the 5-cent debate before the 1930 election, and I gave out the different people with the parts. And
yes.
You played a backbencher.
Yes.
And just started yelling, "Shame, shame."
Oh, I forgot that part. But yes, it's all coming back.
It was great. It was so much fun. That was a great class.
It was really good. Yeah.
But now you're at University College of the North.
Yes.
And you're in Thompson.
Yeah.
And I'm just it's a school that I'd never heard of until I heard that you had gone there. So I'm just wondering, how new is the school? How long has it been around? And sort of what is its overall purpose? Like each institution obviously has sort of different goals that they're trying to do. What's the University College of the North trying to do?
Well, the University College of the North is actually fairly new. It actually turns 10 this year. It was created in 2004. It originally was, the pre-existing institution was Kuwaitan Community College based in the PA and Thompson. But there was seen as to be a real need to create an institution, a university education in the North for Northern people, particularly the high Aboriginal population, because essentially places like Winnipeg, where far removed from the North, are not situated in the North, and a lot of students at the transition from northern flying remote communities to Winnipeg was it was a pretty difficult transition. And so the idea of creating university programming in the North was sort of, it was a long-term goal, and it sort of came into being in 2004. And so we have two main campuses in Thompson and the PA, and we also have regional centers scattered throughout the North in more remote communities as well. I think we have, I'm not very good at statistics, but I think we have about 2,500 to 2,700 students. And that includes, we have college programs, we also have university programs, so diploma programs and also degree programs.
And that would be split between the two campuses?
Yeah. So, and how it works, because we're dealing with great distances. I mean, I grew up in Ontario, where you could drive, you drive 4 hours and you go through multiple cities. I mean, there's literally 4 hours between Thompson and the PA, so we video link our classes, which is, it takes some getting used to, and I'm adapting and trying to change. But so I often actually locate between three locations. So based in Thompson, but I lecture simultaneously to the PA and to Norway House, where one of our regional centers is, and then travel to these locations 2 or 3 times a term to meet with the students and that kind of thing. So.
And what kind of programs are there? I mean, I went through the website yesterday.
Okay.
And it seems like, and you were listed as under like Aboriginal and Northern Studies.
Yes.
So it's not there's not a dedicated history program necessarily.
Actually, there is.
Okay.
I am essentially the only historian on staff, the only trained historian. So I do teach in Aboriginal and Northern Studies, which obviously focuses on the Aboriginal experience. I teach history of the fur trade, history of Métis people, and those courses play into the history major. So after I arrived in, when did I arrive? 2010. So one of the first tasks I was given was to develop a history major. So we did that, and it was implemented in 2000 and Aboriginal and Northern Studies. We have other courses that are cross-listed that go to a history major in some of the social scientists, et cetera, teach into those areas. So, it's interesting, it's challenging, but I think we're doing good work.
Well, it's got to be exciting too to sort of be on the ground floor of creating a program, right? Obviously, it's a lot, but it's got to be kind of fun for you.
It is actually, yeah. No, and the one thing that I've been trying to do, trying to explain how northern Manitoba is not isolated, in the sense that historical processes that were happening in other parts of the world have a huge impact on northern Manitoba and vice versa. That, obviously one of the major focal points in the north is the fur trade, the history of the fur trade, the relationships between Aboriginal people, the Hudson Bay Company, Northwest Company, and imperialism and colonialism. All of those things had an effect. So what was, and I'm trying to emphasize to the students, and what's so exciting to me is, I've taught aspects of the fur trade in other places. This is something that in the north they take completely for granted. Their ancestors, many of the documents that I have them read, textbooks, etc., these are their ancestors. Many of them trace their ancestry from the people who were involved. This is, they're fascinated to learn about it, but in some senses they take it for granted that everyone is connected to the fur trade. I get so excited when I find students saying, "Oh yeah, that's my great-great-great-great-grandfather," or something like that. Wow, they find me a bit weird that way.
But what I find really interesting too, though, is you look at a map of Manitoba, and the PA is really in the middle of the province. So it really highlights how big of a place it really is, and how an institution like this, because of the size of the province, it strikes me that an institution like this 20 years ago, 30 years ago, might not have been able to work just because you're doing all this video link stuff, and you need that technology for this to be able to work just for the communication purposes.
Absolutely. Due to unforeseen circumstances, occasionally, as in any institution, technology fails.
Sure.
And so, unfortunately, we have incredible people who work on that, and it doesn't happen often, but if you lose a video link, there goes the class.
Of course, it's done.
Yeah. So,
but the same thing if there's a snowstorm, on like in North Bay, Ontario, when there's a snowstorm, you can't get up that hill to get up to campus. So
Exactly.
It happens everywhere.
The interesting thing is, though, you think that I moved to a place where it's winter a significant portion of the year. It never closes. The north is exceptionally well adapted to, things that would cripple the south.
Yes.
It's just another day, essentially.
Right.
So.
Right. Well, I know my brother went to UBC, and he got more snow days at UBC than I got in North Bay.
Yes.
So
Yes.
It's all a matter of just what you're used to, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And you said too, there's still snow on the ground.
Well,
there was when you left.
When I left at the beginning of May, there was still snow in the bush. It had melted on the roadways, and it was beginning to open field areas, and it started to melt. But yes, there was still a lot of snow. So.
And just what is it like? Obviously, you're not extreme north, Arctic north.
No.
But your days in the winter are going to be a lot shorter than they were in North Bay. Is that a difficult thing for you to get used to?
It's not been too bad. At the sort of when we move toward the end of December, sun rises about 9 o'clock and sets at about 4 o'clock in Thompson. So, and I must say, it's cold. It's very cold. Obviously, we're often in the minus 30s, 40s, and occasionally into the minus 50s. But I will say that during those daylight hours, because it's so cold, usually it's clear, and so there is a lot of sunshine. So, I can adapt, and I've handled that. So.
And it's a dry cold.
There's truth to that. Absolutely.
No, I often tell people that the coldest I have ever been was like -1 in Vancouver.
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
As opposed to I lived in Regina for 2 years I was at the University of Regina, and -25, -30 in Regina had nothing on. Like -1 in Vancouver.
I was arguing, and I lived in Hamilton for 7 years, and I remember there were days in Hamilton, where it was, exactly sort of hovering around the zero, and it's so damp that it gets through everything. So.
Yeah, and you can never get warm.
Exactly.
You go inside, it doesn't matter, it just sticks to you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And the good thing too is that in the summer, then when it gets hot, there's again no humidity, so it's so it can be days like today where it's nice, it's kind of clear, and it's just no humidity. And the other thing I'm wondering about the school, you talked about there's obviously a very strong Aboriginal community. In the north, and is that the bulk of the students?
Yep. I say the vast majority of our students come from the north, and I don't have specific statistics, but the majority of our students are Aboriginal, yes. We do have some students coming from outside of the region, and we even have some students coming from out of province, but in the main, it is, they're people in the north.
Right. And well, I guess you could draw, too, from northern Saskatchewan, with the PA being right close to the border.
Yeah.
I draw from northern Saskatchewan, maybe even Alberta coming in.
I don't have statistics on that.
But from your experience in your classes, it's mostly people from northern Manitoba.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're here presenting some research, and you're presenting this afternoon, and we're very much looking forward to that. And I'm wondering now, before we get into the specifics of your research, being in Thompson for as long as you have to be in Thompson for the academic year, at least. What kind of challenges does that present to you doing your research?
Certainly there are limitations. I have begun to do some work in the north. I did a small paper looking at the PA during the First World War based on largely newspaper research. So I've done some localized projects. I'm working on a paper on Thompson, which developed in the 1950s onward. But yes, I mean, a lot of my research, unfortunately, I don't have ready access to archives and that kind of thing. I rely a lot on electronic resources and that kind of thing. I do the bulk of my research during the spring and summer months. I have more flexibility, obviously, for travel and that kind of thing. What I do try to do is spend most of that time gathering material and then taking it back with me so that I can spend time writing and that kind of thing during the regular school year. Right,
so you're one of those people that I see at the National Archives who is there for 2 days taking 10,000 pictures.
Yes, I've been known to do that. Yes.
It's fun to see those people, and they're rushing to get all these pictures taken. And I'm sitting there living in Ottawa, just leisurely going through the files and reading through them.
I absolutely miss being, I lived in Hamilton for 7 years, so, the Provincial Archives was just literally, an hour trip down the road and that kind of thing. So, I like where I am, etc. But there are certain things that I pine for sometimes. So yes.
It's one of those things. There's benefits and drawbacks everywhere, right?
And absolutely.
So your research specifically today, you're presenting on William Port.
Yes.
And his sensationalist.
Actually, in fact,
or his effort to limit sensationalism.
Yeah.
Now, first of all, I'm not familiar with Mr. Port. I'm not overly familiar. So who was he?
William Port was the postmaster in the village of Lucan, Ontario, which is north of London. And are you familiar at all with the Donnelly Massacre of 1880?
I am not.
Okay, it's a factionalism feuding in Biddulph Township, surrounding the village of Lucan. There was an ongoing feud, which I actually don't get into in a big way, but in 1880, suffice to say, 5 members of the Donnelly family were murdered, their house set on fire, and they were killed by a local peace committee, as they were referred to. And William Port was the postmaster. He was also operated the telegraph, and so lots of the news was going through his office. He was a man who had his sort of finger on the pulse of what was going on in the community. And as a result of the Donnelly Massacre, the village of Lucan and the larger community were deemed there had been a lot of factionalism and feuding leading up to the murders and that continued afterward. And Lucan has gained a reputation as being, it's been described as the most lawless town in Canada during this period. It's known because of this horrific event that occurred there. And what amateur historians and some scholars have looked at this, and yet Lucan is always portrayed in this sort of very negative light, this place where everything was falling apart. And I helped to sort of co-edit for a local historical society the Port Diaries, which go from 1864 to 1898, I believe it is. And Port kept these diaries. And what I thought was fascinating is, yes, there was violence. Obviously, there was this factionalism. You can't ignore that fact. But when you look at the diaries in their whole, reality is there's far more to this community than the violence and this horrific thing that happened. And so it's there, it's part of it, and yet it isn't what the entire community is about. So in some senses, looking at it, and some people have argued, I had this bit of a debate with myself and a couple of others I was talking about. A diary is obviously a very personal document. It reflects that person, the lens that they're looking through. But this is a man who had strong connections with the community, etc. And he does touch on the violence. He can't ignore it, but it doesn't affect everyone. Mm-hmm. It's a compartmentalized sort of violence. There's people who obviously are fighting with one another, and yet you can't ignore it, but it doesn't infect the entire community. And Lucan is from what I've been able to glean, a fairly typical 19th century community. Religious communities, fraternal societies. There's disputes over sidewalks. It's not a community where people are afraid to go out on the streets. This is not, the violence is compartmentalized. So what I'm using the diaries to do is to take a look at this document and suggesting that the community is far more than a series of events, or it's more than a certain group of actors, essentially, who give it this bad reputation.
Now, you mentioned that, obviously the diary is being written from his perspective. Mm-hmm. And what is he writing about broader issues of the town, or is it mostly about his experience? Or is he writing, I talked to John today, and John was telling me this, and this. Or is he just saying, here's my experience, here's what I'm seeing?
It's mostly from his perspective, obviously. The fact that he's postmaster, the fact that he's getting all the tells, he travels extensively, you get a sense of, and he doesn't shy away from some of the controversies. There's people he does not like. Unfortunately, his daughter inherited the diaries, and at some point she excised certain parts. Okay. So there are certain things that unfortunately are lost to us. But generally, and as he gets older, the diary entries become more voluminous. The diaries explode, essentially, as he gets older. His travel is limited, so he starts spending more and more time, sort of introspection, that kind of thing. But
which sort of happens to everyone. People when they get older,
when your mobility
is,
your mobilities, your social life is perhaps a little more constrained, and so
you start to reflect a little bit.
Yeah. And so he has friends in all kinds of places, and it's interesting that we tend to think of 19th century religious prejudices and that kind of thing. I mean, he is an Anglican. His wife is Roman Catholic, however. He has friends he's a good friend, or he carries on conversations with the Roman Catholic priest. He also has friends in various religious communities. He's fairly, it strikes me, an open-minded man, and he has connections to all sorts of different elements in the community. So,
in writing his diary, though, you say it starts in 1864.
Yes.
And runs through pretty much to the end of the century.
Yep.
And this massacre happens in 1880.
Yes.
So is he talking about the brewing violence throughout, or is he focusing more on the civic affairs?
He doesn't ignore it. The interesting thing is, as I said, the early diaries, the entries are comparatively limited. It's sort of more about the weather. He does comment, Lucan was beset by probably, and it's difficult to quantify this or to compare it, there's a series of, a lot of fires. Like it seems like an abnormal number of fires, which many people have attributed to this ongoing feud. Mm-hmm. And not to make light of it, but the buildings that are being burned are people who are fighting one another, essentially, generally. It seems that there aren't too many, innocent people aren't generally targeted. And of course, it's the 19th century. Lots of places just burn down because this. So he records this stuff. He doesn't tend to sort of make editorial comments about it. He's aware of it. Clearly, he's dismayed by it. He's clearly horrified by what ultimately the worst case of it is, these murders. But at the same time, in between, these are fairly rare occurrences. Obviously, he's dealing with the train is late. The weather is this. The church had a social, well attended, that kind of thing, and commenting on his domestic affairs and that sort of thing.
And then after the incident in 1880, obviously he would have to comment on it.
Yep.
And afterwards, is he sort of returning then to these civic affairs? And does the feud sort of go away after that? Is that sort of the pinnacle of this feud, this massacre, and then everyone sort of settles down?
Well, the problem is, and I don't get into much of this in the paper, and there's a series of trials. Unfortunately, no one is ever convicted, and many people see this as a horrific miscarriage of justice. There's eyewitnesses, etc., but for a variety of reasons, there's mistrials, etc., and no one is ever brought to justice. So there's all this lingering. Many people say, well, the family was a terrible group of people, and they deserved what they got, which I think.
It seems a little harsh.
It seems a little harsh. I mean, however, whatever their failings, I think the general consensus of many people was nobody deserves to get brutally murdered and burned in their home, sort of thing. So there's a lingering sense of it never goes away, and Port always mentions the anniversary every year. He comments on that anniversary, and the problem was the community, I think, as the decades moved, tried to put this behind them, but the reality was everyone identified. The press, anytime Lucan was mentioned, that's the place where the Donnelly family was massacred. And so there was sort of a long period of the local people didn't like to talk about it because they knew people who'd been involved. There were people who obviously almost certainly were involved, who had perpetrated these crimes, who got away with it more or less, and yet so nobody wanted to talk. There's a conspiracy of silence, I suppose, in a sense. And so it never goes away. But I guess my point is that this community is more than the series of tragic events.
Do you notice, or does he comment on after the event, that people, even though there's not innocent victims in this, or people who aren't involved in the feud, who are brought into it through the violence, are people leaving the town?
That's hard to get a sense of. I mean, this is, of course, also a period of rural depopulation generally. Right. I mean, growing urbanization is going on. So there are people, there are comments made to a certain extent about the population. Every time the census is done, in 1881, 1891, and so forth, he makes comments, oh no, we're losing people.
Right.
There are clearly, and I mean, if you do any reading on the Donnelly the events surrounding that, there are people who obviously hightail it out of town on both sides. There are people who have things to hide. There are people who, for their own safety, leave. So there are people who leave, but does the general population, if we assume, do they leave because of these events? No, I think the people who are leaving for a whole variety of reasons. They're going to the cities, they're going, further afield. Obviously, there are people who leave because they have it's in their vested interest to get out of town, essentially. But yeah.
One of the things that I find interesting in listening to this is that I listen to Tony Kornheiser a lot. He works for ESPN, and they talk a lot about legacy, or he talks a lot about legacy, and especially when something bad happens. And he says, you know what, it doesn't matter what happens from now on. That's going to be in the first paragraph of the obituary.
Yes.
Right? And it strikes me that clearly with a place like Lucan, that this would be the situation here, that this event is going to be in the first paragraph
of
everything about this town. I'm wondering, how has the town reacted to this, even contemporarily? Because you mentioned that there are amateur historians who have sort of played this up and perhaps even sensationalized it. Is that from the outside looking into Lucan, and how does Lucan itself look at these events?
That's fascinating because, and some scholars have also looked at this as well. And obviously, when you're investigating a murder, or in this case, what is deemed a massacre, obviously you're focusing in on some pretty sordid, terrible things. And you're absolutely right. And there was, and talking to certain people in the community and other scholars have said, this is a sort of conspiracy science. We don't talk about that. So, and it's in some of the books that I've been reading, some of the people said that they would go and people would clam up, don't talk to us about that, get out of town, we don't want to talk about that. Interestingly enough, though, starting in, I think it was the 1990s, I mean, about the century mark, so in 1980, there began this sort of sense of it's 100 years, versus, of course, by that point, all the players had long since died.
Sure.
And interestingly enough, some of the family members of the descendants of some of the people who were almost certainly involved in the carrying out the murders actually began to say, this is something we should, tourism. It's a small rural town.
Yes. That's what I was thinking, too. It could be a tourist attraction.
In fact, and what they did, they created a historical society, and they have created a museum, which is the Donnelly and Lucan Museum. So it's not shying away from this. Right. And there are other elements. Lucan, in the 1840s, was a destination for escaped slaves from the Underground Railroad. There was a Wilberforce settlement. So that is part of the hit. Unfortunately, the dominant European population drove most of these people out. It's a shameful element. So they acknowledge all these aspects, but the fact that Donnelly is in the name of the museum indicates that the community has done a complete 180 degrees. Instead of trying to forget this, ironically, they have, in a sense, embraced what their ancestors tried so hard to sort of forget about in that way.
Yeah, but like you said, there's been enough time that all the principles are no longer with us.
Yes.
And even probably the first generation after those people would be gone as well. So
Yeah.
I mean, there's no real direct
connection
there anymore. So it's not as personal.
No.
So they can. There's a freedom there that you can discuss these things, and no one will take it as a personal attack.
Yes. I think there's some reservations in some senses. My sense is that some people are worried about the idea that
glorifying it.
You know, that this is a human tragedy, obviously, and yet the town is capitalizing on attracting people, and people do travel. I mean, literally from I'm told all over the world that in Canada this has become sort of a major folklore story, et cetera, and so people do travel there specifically, and for them, Lucan is the Donnelly, where the Donnelly Massacre occurred and that kind of thing. So.
Well, because I mean, there's lots of crime museums around the world, and the thing that I would say is that if they didn't have something, a museum or some sort of marker or something, then you're trying to avoid it, and then is that not more damaging than having the museum? Even if some people perceive it as glorification,
yes,
completely shunning it and not mentioning it at all is probably even worse.
I was looking into some of the other literature, and I am going to blank out here for a moment. The novel Main Street by Sinclair Lewis was based on his hometown in Minnesota, and he derided this place. I mean, it's a negative portrayal of small town America. And initially, I was reading some of the literature. I mean, and deriding your town and saying it's a terrible place is quite different than having a family massacred there.
Yes.
But ironically, the community has subsequently embraced this. They celebrate this. It's a major tourist draw. They have a museum dedicated to this. And so, this was a book which vilified small town life, and yet now in the 20th century or 21st century, they've celebrated this. And similarly, I mean, Stephen Leacock's Sunshine Sketches was clearly based on Aurelia and fictional Mariposa. And my sense from what I've been reading is many Aurelians took offense at this, and yet now they celebrate Leacock. Leacock is a huge draw for tourism and the literary legacy and that kind of thing. So I'm not equating that with murder, but you see that kind of thing happening. Yeah.
Well, as a part then too of a wider, do you view this project that you're working on as part of a wider effort by the town to sort of reclaim its image, rather than have people from the outside say this is this is what you're known for? If they do it internally and say, no, this is part of what we're known for, sure, and then they take ownership of that image.
That's a good point. I hadn't really thought about that, but I think you're absolutely right. Instead of having other people talk about it as well, why don't we engage in this? In a sense, instead of everyone's a whispering campaign. Oh, that's the town where this happened. I mean, they've embraced this. They're taking ownership of it. And they're not shying away from it anymore. Yeah.
Yeah, it gives a sense of agency in the story.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point.
Now, so Lucan, you said it's near London?
Yeah, it's
Ontario?
North of London.
So this town, you mentioned sort of rural depopulation during this time, and so just getting back to the diaries, other than obviously the massacre, does looking at these diaries give any sort of other insight into rural Ontario history in this time, especially maybe Western Ontario, as you get closer down to the tobacco areas and all that?
I mean, absolutely. Often individually, not all of some of there's particular gems in terms of entries, and that kind of thing. But the one thing that I was surprised by was the amount of travel people were doing. Lucan had connections to 2 railways. Port obviously is, solidly middle class. He has some money. The post office duties and so forth tie him down, obviously, but his family is constantly traveling. He has relatives in Michigan. He visits people in Eastern Ontario. He's obsessed with train schedules, and so people traveled a far. I think if you look at newspapers, there's often description of the local gossip columns in the 19th century.
The Smiths are in town,
etc. You get a sense that people are traveling, but when you look at, and I don't want to suggest that Port and his family are, not everyone is doing what they're doing, but he has daughters and grown children coming back to visit frequently. He's often traveling to London. He often travels to Toronto. So the amount of travel that people were doing, it somewhat surprised me. I mean, I knew that they did travel. I knew there were trains. I knew all that kind of thing. But you get a sense that people are far more tied into, they're part of a local community, but then they're part of a larger community as well. the newspapers. He talks about all the newspaper subscriptions he has, what books he's reading, that kind of thing. So you get a sense of, again, it's one individual. He's not representative of everyone necessarily, but you get a sense that there's more going on, that there's more it's a more dynamic place, I think, than we might think. And I mean, small towns in the Canadian context and small towns in many contexts, they were much more important to the economy. Small towns obviously were dwarfed by places like London and Toronto and Hamilton, but there was far more economic activity. They were important places. Canada still had, predominantly rural, although the urban population is growing. So, and culturally, lots of events, theater troupes, amateur theatricals, dinners, all of that kind of thing. And he spends a lot of time on funerals. I shouldn't say he loved funerals, but he went to a lot of funerals. And it crossed denominations, And I mean, I think we tend to think of people as being fairly prejudiced in terms of, he didn't like the Methodists. That's the one thing I will say. And I'm going to highlight that in my talk. I sometimes wonder if it's tongue-in-cheek, but he's often making comments about the Methodists and how it doesn't turn out very well, etc. So.
And what are people doing in Lucan? Like, what's the draw to the town? Why are people going there before they start leaving?
Well, it's obviously it's a hub. It's the urban. It's a service center for the rural community. I mean, predominantly surrounded by a massive agricultural belt. So it's people come in to trade, business, stores, etc. It is a transportation hub. It's connected to 2 railways: north, south, east, west. So it's transportation, it's banking, it's communications with the post office, the telegraph.
So in that type of town, he would be sort of one of the bigger citizens, like one of the more influential citizens.
He's not exactly at the top of the heap. There are a couple of families who are. He refers to the wealthy end of town. He calls it Quality Hill, and it's clear he's doing it in a pejorative sense.
Yeah.
I mean, there are certain people he does not like. There are some very wealthy people who he finds reprehensible, and unfortunately, we are pretty sure that these are some of the things his daughter excised from the record.
Right.
There are a few things she missed, which is clear that, but he makes all these scathing references, and you can tell that he doesn't think much of people. He has to work for a living, obviously, the postmaster. It's a good living, etc. But he's sort of on that fence, so he pokes fun at his social betters, I suppose, in that sense. But he certainly is I think, a person of respect in the community. And it's interesting, there are internal references in his diary. There are some publications, local histories that were being done in the 1880s and so forth. And we're certain he wrote for another newspaper, writing a column for the paper. And he also makes reference, there was a Goodspeed who put out a history of the county of Middlesex in 1889. And in his diary, he lends his diary and gives excerpts of that for this history. So he uses them. So he uses the diary to help compose history, write these things, but he also appears to lend his diaries occasionally to people. And so he uses it. He's consciously, in a sense, recording history, I guess.
So he's aware of his significance in the town and understanding that if there's going to be a history of this place, he's pretty much the guy to do it.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously, it has all these biases, etc.
Sure.
And the one person I may touch on this in the talk if I have time. His personal relationships become more and more important. I mean, as he ages, he loses an adult child. He has a large number of children. His relationship with his wife, I would love to know what his wife thought. Because their relationship, if you read his diary, suggests that it sort of deteriorates. And they're civil to one another, etc. But I just love to know what his wife would have been writing about him at the same time.
Right.
So unfortunately, that's lost to us. But.
And there's no other diaries from the town that comment on him as the postmaster.
No, there's a few. Without the diaries, I was thinking about this. Other sources.
Well, they had a newspaper.
There wasn't even a newspaper in town. There was a couple of other papers in local towns that covered it. He would probably be known, as an upstanding citizen, and that kind of thing. He was a local antiquarian who contributed to some local histories, but we wouldn't really know that much. There's nothing comparable, and so. One thing, a lot of scholars and amateur historians who've looked at the Donnelly Massacre have used Port's diary, but only as it related to the Donnelly Massacre. So it leaves the vast majority of what this document says, it's left on the cutting room floor, essentially, because they're looking for the nuggets about what's it say about the Donnelly Massacre. And so what my attempt is to reclaim that and say that, yes, he comments on that, but it says so much more about his lone life and all that kind of thing.
Part of reclaiming it, is there a way to take that understanding, take that knowledge, and expand it into the regional part of it, or even national part of it, and say, this is part of a larger trend through these smaller communities, these smaller rural communities across the country?
I think so, and I think that's what I'm trying to suggest, is that I think that we need to think about when we think of places, and I was thinking of Batoche in the Northwest Territories, and now Saskatchewan. Batoche is going to forever be remembered as the center of the Northwest Resistance. Batoche has a very complex history before and after, and it's far more than, there's no question that the Northwest Resistance was, you can't ignore that.
It's in the first paragraph.
Yes, absolutely. It's in the fourth. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But the reality is that there's more going on. There's more complexity. There's a much larger human drama or story being carried out. And I think that we tend to think of diaries as being personal documents, but I think that we can take, in a sense, crossing boundaries. They are personal. They are obviously from the lens of one individual, but they can tell us something about the larger community. If a diary is telling, I'm constantly living in fear, I'm looking out my window, I'm afraid to go out on the street, that suggests something. But, Port is carrying on a regular life in a community described as the wildest, most lawless place in Canada, so that puts it, it tempers that dramatically, and it even suggests that it's a lie in a sense that, yes, there's bad elements, there's terrible things going on, but for most people, life goes on.
Well, it almost speaks, it sort of speaks to notions of trauma. And, say what you will about Malcolm Gladwell, I really like him, but in his most recent book, he talks about this, like near misses.
Yes, yeah.
Right? And so if there's a bomb goes off a block away from you, you feel great. Yeah. Like, it missed me, and so I'm fine, and you're not affected by it, whereas the person who's 10 blocks away might be more affected by it because it wasn't as near miss. They just see a bomb go off, like, oh, that could have, but whereas the near miss is good. So in that environment, he's like, well, this happened in my town. So maybe it's almost a liberating thing if you believe that near miss theory. So he can. So not only does it say something then maybe about small towns, but about notions of trauma and the community response to traumatic events. Yeah,
absolutely. And I live in Thompson, Manitoba, obviously.
Yes.
And unfortunately, Thompson has a reputation for a lot of violence,
yes,
etc. And yet that's not something that it's there, it's awful, there's things that, but again, it's not something that...
You don't define the town by it.
Exactly.
It doesn't define Thompson.
Right. But I think often people looking, if they know nothing else about it, often these are the things that,
right,
and the same thing is said, there's, and I'm not dismissing it, I'm not trivializing the things that do happen, yet the community is much more than that, what's going on there, etc.
Yeah, it's easy for a newspaper to print the story about a murder than it is about the community bake sale.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So in that context, people are more familiar with the violence or the negative things that are associated with places. And I think that happens everywhere.
Yeah.
And maybe even more so in places in the north or more isolated communities where the only time nationally we hear about them is when something bad happens.
When something negative happens. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So again, it's part of a reclaiming process, is that these are real places with real people living lives, a lot of whom are happy, and these communities are vibrant with, there's cultural elements and there's things going on. So why should we define it by these singular events?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So you mentioned, so this is what you're presenting on today, but you mentioned you're working on a bunch of sort of other projects. You mentioned a new project about the North, or
I have a paper that's been in progress perhaps a little too long, but sort of examining the emergence of Thompson, Manitoba, and sort of earlier work was in urban and suburban history that I've done, and so I was sort of looking at Thompson was designed in the 1950s and 60s, and it looks like a typical sort of I describe it, it's very suburban in feel, the cul-de-sacs, the winding streets, the 1960s housing, that kind of thing. There's no downtown in a traditional sense. It's a plaza and a mall, that kind of that thing. So I was looking at that. I have a few other side projects that I'm working on. I'm sort of, community history is sort of where I've been interested in. I've done some studies in summer cottage communities as well. that's sort of an ongoing project. And I recently came across a wonderful. I'm constantly amazed at what people squirrel away in their attics, and some papers that I published are based on things that people have said. Oh, are you interested? I have this stack of letters or documents that my grandfather kept. I'm like, incredible material that I'm drooling over. Which turned into various little projects along the way. So.
And have you noticed, since you've been in Thompson, that sort of thing happens more frequently? That you're around as a historian, you're known at UCN, and maybe are people coming to you maybe more regularly?
Perhaps to a certain extent there, but in other aspects of my life, when I'm traveling, I stay in Ontario at various times, and I guess I have a reputation. I don't know, people, you do history. Yes. So the comments that were made at the award ceremony, you do history.
You should meet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But occasionally people will just, I have these documents. Another project I worked on, a local woman in the community I grew up in said, I don't know if these are of any use. She brought a stack of diaries that her uncle kept from 1913 to 1964. And I mean, someday I would love to, I have no idea, but these are incredible, and I get very excited by these kinds of things.
Well, why not? It is exciting, right? It's fun to, especially when you're the first one to look at it.
Exactly.
Right?
I also, totally unreal, one woman I know who's in her 90s gave me a letter, which I will do something with eventually. I love maybe I'll never do anything. It was a letter that her grandmother wrote in 1919 about the first election in Ontario where she had the right to vote.
Oh, wow.
She was an elderly woman, and she was so excited about having the right to finally exercise her franchise. And she was complaining that her sister thought, women shouldn't vote. And she's basically she's writing saying her sister is, get a hold of yourself. This is something that's long overdue. Yeah. And I'm just fascinated that you get this woman who probably pent up, finally, we have this right, and I'm going to make sure I'm going to drag myself to the poll to make sure I have this right to do that kind of thing. So these little vignettes that I just quite love. So.
Well, it makes it fun.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
To find those sorts of, especially when you get, or for me at least, I found, you get these, you're involved in these big projects for years and years and years, and when you come across something that is like a little vignette like that you can take some time and work on it a little bit, it's fun to
absolutely
break away and tell and sort of go back to being the storyteller in a way.
Yeah, I think that's what I have to keep around. I think that's how I became interested in history is, I don't know if they're supposed to admit this, but the story is, I think initially grabs most of us, and this connection to the past, and these are real people with foibles and problems and issues, and yet how they sort of muddled through, I guess.
Yeah. And for me, it's now that I'm lecturing now in classes, the stuff that I found that's the most successful is when you're telling the stories. Yeah. Obviously, you have to present the theory and the analysis part of it, but the stuff that
resonates or sticks
is the stories and the storytelling part of it that really, and that's the fun part for me. And two, when someone says, you should meet this, my husband, my sister, my brother, when they say that, it's because they want to exchange stories.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's sort of what draws people in. So I think it's exciting that especially that letter. That letter sounds really good. Yeah,
it's just
really good.
You get and she was also quite witty and I would love, and it's in a sense this is somebody I'd like to have met.
Yeah. If you could get that same level of excitement and meet her,
yes,
and actually have her say it would be
exactly.
Because if you can read enthusiasm on the page, imagine what she'd be like in person.
Exactly. Yeah.
Just controlling the room, it'd be great. So a lot on the go, and you're in Thompson, but do you spend most of your summers sort of moving around doing research?
Doing research, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Which I know in Thompson, it's probably the nicest time of year to be there. But
right.
But
that's the way the academic thing works. Maybe you could get them to change their academic year.
So the summer,
so that you're there in the summer, and then you could spend the summer somewhere. Spend the winter somewhere else. Your 4 months off are November through February, the academic year.
Winter does have its charms, and I've taken up snowshoeing and that kind of thing.
Okay.
When it's although unfortunately too often it's too cold to do any winter outdoors activity except like walk to work layered in.
Bundled up. You probably have invested in some really good winter stuff, though.
Yeah, right. You have to.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you doing the podcast. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's been great, and thank you.
So that's Greg Stott, University College of the North in Thompson, and also the campus in The Pa. If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, it's historyslam@gmail.com. Twitter is @Dr. Shawnee Fever. And if you're out and you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi for me.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Be sure to check out Active History for more features, articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.